Good morning. How are you this morning? I'm chipper as ever. So here we are. I've got my cup of tea, which should give you a hint. I have my Boston Marathon shirt on. And so today we're going to talk about the Boston Tea Party, which was never really named Boston Tea Party until like 1826. Somebody made it up, some newspaper guy. But anyway, the event itself took place on December the 16th in 1773, and it dealt with three ships that were in Boston Harbor that had about 340 chests of tea on board. And those ships were the Beaver, the Dartmouth, and the Eleanor. Now, believe it or not, they weren't even British ships. They were American-owned ships, and they had gone to England, dropped off some goods, and brought tea back. And they were owned by Americans, and the tea was owned by Americans. But the colonists didn't like the idea of bringing this British tea in. So we have to talk about why we had a problem with tea. Some people say it was the tax, but there was already a tax on tea long before the Tax Act of 1773. And that was part of another act that we had talked about. They repealed part of the act, but the tea tax remained. The real issue was the East Indian Tea Company, which was a British company that had the tea trade all wrapped up for a number of years. And the way that it worked is the tea would come, this company, the East Indian Tea Company, would buy the tea in India, and it was shipped to England. And they paid a tax on, when they brought it in, they paid a tax to the British government. They then sold it to wholesalers, who then sold it to merchants, and the merchants then took it to the colonies and sold it. So there was a lot of price increases in this tea and the cost of tea. So being good Americans, we took to smuggling, and some of our most illustrious leaders were actually smugglers. John Hancock, for one, was a smuggler. Sam Adams was another smuggler. And so they would buy Dutch tea and they would bring it over, and they could sell it much cheaper than the East India Tea Company. So that company was going out of business. So what the British government did was they lowered the cost of the taxes to the East India Tea Company so that they then could, and they eliminated the middleman. So the East India Tea Company was now authorized to sell their tea to the American colonies directly. And so they were undermining the cost of the smugglers' tea, and the smugglers didn't like it. And that was the real reason that they had this whole Boston Tea Party. So really what we're talking about is we're talking about 340 cases or casks of tea, roughly around 92,000 pounds of tea. And that was worth about, at that time, the value was about 9,600 pounds, which is how, don't miss the weight with the dollar value. The British used the pound. And so it was about 9,600 pounds and a couple shillings, but that doesn't matter. Or in today's American dollar, about $1.7 million. And it's a whole lot of tea bags. So Sam Adams called a meeting at the the South Church, which was the largest place in Boston at the time, and he tried to convince the people, not to do anything. But it was really kind of like a front. They had to do something because there was a 30-day limit on these ships. They had to unload their stuff and pay the tax within 30 days. Otherwise, they would have to leave. And but the governor Hutchinson wouldn't let them leave. So they had this event. Some people think it was staged. Some people said it was honest. But about 30 to 130 people, depend on who you talk to. And I've talked to a lot of those people, and nobody seems to know the real number of how many people were there. They kind of dressed up. They kind of didn't dress up, and so they went down to the harbor. They boarded the three ships, and they told the crew to stand back. The crew stood back. There was almost no violence whatsoever. I think one guy got beat up, and that was it. And the captain stood there. They watched it all take place, and the Bostonians then just dumped all this tea into the harbor, of which we don't really know where it is because Boston Harbor has changed. We have some ideas, and people are still looking for the Boston tea, thinking they'll get a good brew out of it, a little saltiness into it. So it really wasn't about taxation because there was already taxation on it. It was really about greed of the East Indian Tea Company wanting to sell their tea, the British government wanting to get them to sell their tea, and the smugglers wanting to continue selling their tea because it was all about the money. It really had nothing to do with taxes because they were already happily paying the tax. It was like 3 shilling or three shillings on a pound. So anyway, so the effects of the Boston Tea Party rippled down through the colonies, and there was more Boston Tea Parties. There was a Philadelphia Tea Party, there was a Charleston Tea Party, there was an Annapolis Tea Party, and they rippled all down through the other colonies. But Parliament took a disliking to this action, thought it was barbaric, and so they closed Boston Harbor to any trade whatsoever, which really impacted the residents of Boston. And it also returned the British troops this is when the British troops came back, was in 1773, 1774. They came back to Boston, took up quarters, and as we spoke about just the other day, led up to the Boston Massacre and other things. And as things progressed, they just kept sending more and more troops. So there you go. That's the story of the Boston Tea Party. Enjoy your hot toddy, and we'll see you tomorrow.